The barrier was supposed to move. Harry had done this before. Last year he'd run at it with his trolley and his nerves and arrived on the other side intact, which had seemed like a miracle at the time, but which he now understood was simply how the barrier worked. You walked quickly, you didn't flinch, you let the magic do the rest. He was not a nervous person by nature. He had been trained out of nervousness the way some children are trained into it. The Dursleys had made it quite clear, across 11 years of pointed instruction, that nervousness was a waste of everyone's time, and that Harry's feelings in particular. He had learned to go quiet instead. Quiet was useful. Quiet got you through. So he ran at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, with his trolley and his trunk and Hedwig's cage balanced on top, and Hedwig rattled against the bars with the affronted dignity of a bird who had not been warned, and the barrier did not move. Harry's trolley stopped. The brickwork pressed back against his palms, solid and indifferent. The ordinary stone wall of an ordinary train station, with absolutely no interest in being magical today. "Try again," Ron said. They tried again. They went faster this time, the way you were supposed to, apparently, if you were running at a wall on faith, and needed the faith to be the stronger of the two things. The wall was stronger. The wall was always going to be stronger. It was a war. "The vibration's not there," Ron said, pressing his palm flat against the brick. His face was doing the particular arrangement of features that meant he was working very hard not to look worried. "It's meant to vibrate a bit when it's going to let you through. This isn't doing that. This is just solid." "I know," Harry said. He looked up. The concourse clock said 11:04. The Hogwarts Express had already been gone for 4 minutes, which meant it was currently somewhere north of London, carrying every other student back to the castle, carrying Ginny Weasley on her first day, carrying all the comfortable, familiar weight of his actual life. The life that was his, not borrowed. That was the thing about the burrow. It had been brilliant, and it had felt like family, in a way that Harry had been careful not to examine too closely. The way you were careful about a flame when you knew you were the kind of person who got burned. He'd spent weeks there learning the creak of the stairs and the smell of Molly's kitchen and the particular way Arthur looked when he was pretending not to be excited about something Muggle. He'd been grateful. He'd also been aware, with the quiet precision of someone who has always known they are a guest, that the burrow was not his. Hogwarts was his. The castle was the place where he didn't have to calculate, didn't have to check, didn't have to wonder in the night if this was the last night before something changed. And now Hogwarts was 4 minutes gone and getting further. "We could send an owl," Ron said. "Explain what happened. Our owls are in their cages." Ron looked at Hedwig. Hedwig looked back at Ron with the pointed patience of an owl who was currently inside a cage and was therefore not available for correspondence. "Right," Ron said. "Right, yeah, we could wait, I suppose. Someone will come back for us." Harry did not say what he was thinking, which was that no one was coming back, because everyone who might come back had gone through the barrier 20 minutes ago and was currently on the train getting progressively further away. He did not say it because Ron's face was already doing enough work managing what it looked like, and there was no reason to add to the project. He heard the footsteps before he turned. He'd spent enough time at the burrow to know Molly Weasley's walk. It had a particular quality of direction to it, a purposefulness, the sound of someone moving toward things rather than among them. He turned, and she was coming around the end of the nearest pillar, with her traveling cloak still on, and her face going through several calculations very quickly. She crossed the platform to them, to Harry first, which he noticed, and didn't know what to do with, and put one warm hand briefly on his shoulder. She looked at the wall. "When did this happen?" "We don't know exactly," Ron said. "We hit it, and it just didn't. She pressed her palm flat against the brickwork. Whatever she felt, or failed to feel, made her press her lips together once, and then release them. She withdrew her hand with the efficiency of someone who has made up their mind and does not intend to change it. "Stay here," she said. "Your father is just outside." Arthur had not, in the end, gone very far. He was still near the station's main entrance, standing with his muggle tie slightly off-center and his eyes moving over the departures board, the way they moved over interesting muggle things, that particular absorbed attention he gave to electrical items and rubber ducks. Molly had him back inside in under 2 minutes. He examined the barrier properly. Both palms against the brick, then an ear, then a crouching inspection of the base of the wall that drew a few curious looks from passing commuters, none of which he noticed. When he straightened, his expression was careful. There's a charm on it. You can feel the edge where it starts. It's not a fault in the magic. Someone put this here deliberately. "Can it be undone?" Ron asked. "Not by me, not here." He glanced at his watch, then back at the wall, in the measured way of a man running a calculation that had already come to its answer. The train was gone. That was a fixed point. Harry watched him arrive at it, and watched the moment after, when he turned and looked at Harry directly. Not at the scar, which was where people usually looked, but at his face, the way you looked at someone you were actually trying to see. "We are not going to leave you here," Arthur said. It was a very simple sentence. Harry was not sure why it sat in his chest the way it did, in the particular place where braced things lived. They drove, on the ground, not in the air, the Ford Anglia moving through London in its ordinary capacity, while Molly sat in the front with her hands folded, and Arthur navigated the city with the expression of someone quietly constructing a plan. Harry and Ron sat in the back, with Hedwig's cage between them, and the morning sun coming through the windows at an angle that turned everything a shade warmer than it actually was. The city went past, suburbs, roads that narrowed and curved and began to look less like roads, and more like the kind of countryside that didn't know what time it was. Ron leaned his head back against the seat. Hedwig, satisfied that no one was going to do anything interesting, tucked her head under her wing. Harry held the cage steady against the motion of the car, and watched England unreal outside the glass, and tried to do what he was good at, which was not thinking about things too directly. Not thinking about where they were going. Not thinking about the fact that Molly had crossed the platform to him first. Not thinking about the specific timbre of Arthur's voice when he'd said, "We are not going to leave you here." There was something happening in his chest. Small, quiet, without a name, the way things were when they were just beginning, before you'd had time to understand what they were. He was careful with it. He had always been careful with beginning things. But he didn't move away from it either. He sat in the back of the Ford Anglia with his owl's cage on his knee and the September light warming the side of his face, and let the something sit there unnamed, taking up exactly as much space as it wanted. The thing about the burrow was that Harry knew it. He knew the step on the stairs that creaked, the third from the top, which he'd learned to avoid by instinct during the summer weeks when the house was full, and knowing where to put your feet quietly was a kind of social grace. He knew that the kitchen window stuck when it rained, and that the garden produced an astonishing number of gnomes, and that Arthur's shed was not to be disturbed without asking, or at least not without good reason, and Harry wasn't sure he'd ever have a good enough reason. He knew all of this. He had not, in any of the weeks he'd spent learning it, expected to come back. He carried his trunk up the stairs, carefully, on account of the third step, and Ron took the heavier end without being asked, walking backwards the way you did when you knew the staircase. The room was, as they'd left it that morning, two narrow beds, the shelf of objects Ron had accumulated over a childhood in this house, the window looking out over the garden and the orchard, and the particular shade of afternoon light that made Devon look like it had been placed there with intention. Hedwig moved in her cage, and when Harry opened it, she stepped out and went directly to the perch by the window with the authority of an owl who had already made up her mind about the best available spot. Harry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his trunk. In July, that trunk had sat in this room, and he had understood its presence clearly, the trunk of a guest which would leave at the end of the visit. Now, he was not sure what to call it. He was not sure what to call himself in this house, in this room. Guest wasn't right anymore, but he didn't have another word ready. Ron dropped onto his own bed and put his arms behind his head and stared at the ceiling. He was tall for 12, all the Weasley boys seemed to be, and in his own room, surrounded by his own things, he looked particularly like himself, which Harry found in an unfocused way to be a relief. He looked at Ron and felt what he always felt, looking at Ron, which was a straightforward and slightly inconvenient gratitude that Ron existed. "Mum all sort it," Ron said, which was not quite a statement about today, and not quite a statement about anything else in particular. They left it there. The afternoon moved slowly. Fred and George were at school. Percy. Ginny was at school. The house was quiet in the way of a house that usually ran 7 people, and was currently operating at a significant deficit. And the quiet had a texture to it, a mild wrongness, like a chord missing 2 notes. Ron found a game of gobstones with 2 pieces gone, and proposed they play anyway. This turned out to be less satisfying than it sounded, which was not very satisfying to begin with, and by the end of it they had invented a version of the rules that bore essentially no relation to the original, and they were both laughing at something that had not quite been funny, and that was almost normal. Almost was the part that would need attending to later. Ron had been Harry's best friend for a year, and in that year he had worked something out through observation rather than calculation. Harry did not know how to ask for things. He did not know how to be grateful out loud, without it becoming a thing that needed managing. So he was grateful quietly, and Ron received it quietly, and they had an arrangement. It worked. But there was a new question in the room tonight, unasked and heavy, which was, what is this then? Ron's parents had not come upstairs to explain. Ron didn't know either. Harry, who had spent 11 years being very good at not asking questions about his own situation, was not about to change that. Dinner happened the way things happened in the burrow, with both hands busy and no ceremony at all. Except that tonight there were only 3 places at the table, and the kitchen had a different quality to its noise. More attentive, somehow, the way a room becomes when the people in it are paying attention to each other, rather than to the general chaos of everyone being in a hurry at once. Molly moved around the kitchen the way she moved when she was cooking for 8, distributed, efficient, stirring one thing and checking another, and she told Harry to set the table as though it was simply what one did in this kitchen, which somehow made it feel like it was. Arthur came in from the garden with dirt on his sleeve, washed his hands at the sink, sat down, and picked up the evening's owl post without any of the ceremony of someone whose life had changed direction. Harry watched both of them for signs of what they were actually thinking, and got nothing except they had decided something. And they were not frightened by it. The food was extraordinary. Not because it was unusual, it was shepherd's pie and roasted carrots and bread from that morning, but because there was enough of it, and then more than enough, and Molly kept adding to his plate with the quiet efficiency of someone who had noticed without remarking on it that he ate like someone who had been given inadequate portions for some time. He ate until he was full, past full. He had not been pastful in longer than he could easily place. Nobody mentioned school, nobody mentioned the barrier. After dinner, Arthur read his post, and Harry washed up with Ron, passing dishes back and forth in the rhythm of a thing they had done before, and neither of them said a word about tomorrow. He couldn't sleep. The room smelled the way it had smelled in July, which was like Ron's room, which was not his room, and the distinction had not mattered in July because he had been going back to Privet Drive when summer ended. It mattered now in a new and specific way that he was trying not to examine too directly. He lay on his back for a while. He looked at the ceiling. Then he got up without his shoes and went out onto the landing. Voices from below, low, not loud enough to make out words, and then loud enough if he sat down on the step and held his breath. He sat with his back against the banister and his knees drawn up. Arthur's voice. The ministry would want an explanation. They would need a good one quickly because the Dursleys held Harry's guardianship papers under Muggle law, and probably under Wizarding law too. And if the Dursleys decided to make difficulties, Molly's voice, she did not care what the Dursleys wanted. Arthur, patient. That wasn't the point. The point was what the law said. Molly, lower but no softer. She had seen those people's house. She had seen the room. A silence. Something shifted in the kitchen. A chair or a hand on a table. Arthur said, "We need to contact Dumbledore." Molly said, "I know." Then she said something else. She said it quietly, in the particular voice she used when she had finished considering and arrived at the other side. "I am not sending him back there." Harry sat very still. He pressed his spine against the banister until he could feel the wood grain through his shirt. Outside the hall window, the sky was dark and extraordinarily clear, the kind of clear you only got well away from the city, and there were more stars visible than he had ever seen from Privet Drive. He sat on the step and looked at them and breathed. He was still on the landing when the scratch of Arthur's quill began in the kitchen below. He heard the pauses in it, the long pause of someone reading back and finding the words wrong, then the scrape of starting again. The first draft went on too long. The second was shorter, but still not right. He could tell by the sound of crossing out. The third was quick, a few lines, a pause, and then the particular note of finality that came from folding parchment. Then the sound of an owl being roused. Errol made one long complaint about the hour, and then was quiet, cooperative, in the way of an old animal that had seen enough to know when argument was pointless. A rush of cool September air reached the landing, and then was gone. Harry went to the window at the end of the hall. The owl was already lost in the dark, heading north, carrying 3 lines of Arthur's handwriting toward the Scottish Highlands. Harry stood at the window for a while and watched the place where the shape of it had disappeared, which was indistinguishable from the rest of the dark. The kitchen light stayed on below him. He could hear Arthur and Molly moving around in the quiet way of people who have said the important things and are now doing ordinary tasks in comfortable proximity. He went back to bed. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. He thought, "I know which step creaks." He thought, "She has seen the room." He thought, very quietly, and not at all in the direction of the feeling, that something had happened today that he did not have a name for yet, and that he was not going to look at it directly until he had a better idea of whether it was the kind of thing that lasted. He fell asleep before he could decide. Dumbledore arrived at the Burrow the following afternoon, while Harry was sitting at the kitchen table, not particularly doing anything. He saw him first, through the window, a tall shape moving up the garden path in robes so extravagantly purple that even the September sunlight seemed to take notice. and his first instinct was to move away from the glass. That was the instinct of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life trying not to be in the way when important things were happening. His second instinct arrived a half-second later. Stay where he was. Dumbledore at Hogwarts was enormous in a way that had nothing to do with his height. The castle organized itself around him, the stone corridors, the candles, the particular quality of silence that fell when he entered a room. Here, in the Burrow's back garden, picking his way past a row of Wellington boots and what appeared to be a Muggle lawnmower Arthur had been meaning to dismantle, he was something different, not smaller. If anything, more vivid, the way a fire looks larger in the open than it does in a grate. Harry watched him through the kitchen window and felt, under the complicated other feelings of the past 24 hours, the first thing that was simply uncomplicated: relief that someone who knew what he was doing was here. Molly opened the back door before he reached it. Ted Master, Mrs. Weasley. He had the particular warmth he seemed to reserve for people he genuinely liked, the kind that wasn't performed. Your garden is in remarkable condition. The gnomes have been seen to recently, I think, this morning, Molly said, in the voice of someone who appreciated the observation, but was not going to be distracted from worry by it. Come inside. The kettle is on. He accepted tea, with the pleasure of a man for whom small comforts were not a small matter. He sat across from Arthur at the kitchen table, settled his half-moon spectacles on his crooked nose, and regarded them with the unhurried attention of someone who has already read the situation and is waiting for the account that confirms it. "Well then," he said, "tell me what happened." Arthur told him. He had been composing and recomposing the account since the previous night, and it came out efficiently now, in the ordered way of someone who had worked for the ministry long enough to know how to report a sequence of events without editorializing the sealed barrier, the charm on it, the decision. When he finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment that had a particular texture to it, the texture of a mind running through implications it had already partly mapped. "I had anticipated something of this kind," Dumbledore said. "Not these specific events, but something." He set his teacup down with care. "Then I should explain what you've set in motion, and what the barrier being sealed may mean." Arthur had spent 20 years at the ministry, and he had developed in that time the particular internal composure of someone who received difficult information regularly. He sat with his hands still and his face careful, and listened to Dumbledore explain the bond of blood charm in the same way he listened to ministry briefings, with the attention of a man preparing to act on what he was told, not to react to it. He had told Molly last night, "We need to contact Dumbledore," she had said. "I know." He had not said the other thing, which was that he was frightened, that he had been frightened since they walked back through the station and the city outside the Ford Anglia windows had gone past, and nothing about any of it felt simple. Dumbledore explained it carefully and without condescension. The charm had been sealed through Petunia Dursley, Lily Potter's sister, her only surviving blood relative, and through Petunia's choice to take Harry into her home and call him family. As long as Harry could call that house home and return to it each year, the protection held. It was, Dumbledore said, the most reliable form of protective magic he knew of, rooted not in spellwork, but in love's own logic. Lily had died for Harry, and that sacrifice had been anchored in Petunia's grudging, resentful, but undeniable act of shelter. He paused. "Harry has been away from Privet Drive since August," he said. "The charm has been fraying for some weeks. If he does not return before the end of this calendar year, it will be gone." He looked at Arthur over the top of his spectacles. Voldemort, in his current state, cannot physically act on Harry. He is too diminished for direct action. But he is not without servants, and servants do not require a body to do harm. But he is not without servants. Harry had not been told to leave the kitchen. He had moved toward the doorway when the adults settled at the table, in the automatic way of someone who had always understood that certain conversations were conducted without him. But the doorway was still within the kitchen, and nobody had closed the door, and he stood with his shoulder against the frame and listened to the word "servants" land in the room and spread out into the silence around it. Molly had been sitting with her hands around her cup throughout. She let Dumbledore finish all of it, the blood and the charm and the servants, and then she set her cup down with a precision that suggested she had been waiting for the end of the explanation the way you waited for the end of a sentence you already knew the shape of. And she said she knew what Voldemort's servants did. Everyone who had lived through that war knew what had been done to Frank and Alice Longbottom, and none of them had forgotten. She said, "Privet Drive is not safety. 4 Privet Drive is the address where a child was put in a cupboard under the stairs for the first 10 years of his life, and she had seen that room, and she was not willing to treat a charm over that room as an adequate answer to the question of Harry's protection." She said, quietly finished, "I will not send him back." The kitchen was still. Dumbledore looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "No, I rather thought you wouldn't." There was something in the way he said it that was not contradiction, and not quite agreement, but was in some way larger than either. Arthur set down his teacup and asked the question that had been waiting beneath Molly's answer. If the charm was gone, what protection did Harry actually have? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment that stretched. "The charm was one layer," he said. "Hogwarts is another. Its wards are several centuries old and not to be underestimated. I will arrange additional measures." Something shifted in his expression, becoming more precise. "But there is something else I need to tell you. It concerns Ginny." He told them about the diary. He told them carefully. He suspected more than he could prove, and he would not name a man as a criminal on suspicion alone, not even in a private kitchen. But he told them what he knew. A diary had arrived in Ginny's school, things during the Diagon Alley visit, in circumstances he found troubling. He believed the diary was not simply a diary. He believed he knew whose hand had arranged for it to be there. He watched Arthur's face do what Arthur's face did when he was managing anger through discipline, the slight stiffening around the jaw, the very still hands. "Watch her owls," Dumbledore said. "If anything she writes home doesn't sound like her, if the letters are too cheerful or too flat, or if something in the wording is simply wrong, tell me at once. I am looking into this. But you should know." He said it and then looked past Arthur, at the kitchen doorway, and in a completely different register, lighter, warmer. He said, "Harry, you may as well sit down." Harry sat down. He took the chair at the corner of the table between Molly and the window, the one where the September light came in at an angle and made the kitchen look more golden than it actually was, and tried to arrange his expression into something that communicated he had arrived only recently. Dumbledore looked at him with eyes that were very blue and paid complete attention, and explained that Harry would return to Hogwarts on the morning of the 3rd of September, 2 days, via a ministry-authorized portkey that Arthur would arrange through his office. The late enrollment would be logged as a medical accommodation. The ministry had accommodated similar situations in the past, Dumbledore said, in a tone that suggested the relevant paperwork already existed somewhere on his desk. 2 days. Harry looked at the table. Then he looked up, because Molly was looking at him. She said 2 more dinners then. He said, all right, he did not examine. At that moment, why the words felt the way they did in his throat. He had eaten dinners in this kitchen in July and August, and understood the whole time that they had an end point, that when September came, he would go back to school, and then in the following summer he would go back to Privet Drive, and the end point was what made the middle possible. Now the end point was different. Now there was a portkey in 2 days, and whatever came after that, and on the other side of school there was no Privet Drive waiting to receive him, and the middle was different, and he didn't know yet what to do with the difference. Molly put more tea in his cup without being asked. He wrapped his hands around the warmth of it. Dumbledore stayed for another hour. He talked with Arthur about the portkey logistics, and about the ministry paperwork, and about 2 or 3 other things that Harry followed, with half his attention, and didn't entirely understand. When he left through the back gate, he paused to look at the garden again, and said something complimentary about the soil conditions that made Arthur brighten, in the way he brightened when Muggles achieved something interesting, except it was his own garden. Then he was gone up the lane, around the bend, and the afternoon resettled around the fact of his absence. Harry sat at the kitchen table for a while, after he was still there when Molly started on dinner. The portkey was an old boot. Harry had not known this until Dumbledore produced it from his coat pocket at 5 minutes to 7 on the morning of the 3rd of September. And then he had known it very specifically, because the boot was right there. He and Ron and Dumbledore crouched in the Burrows garden in the early morning cold, with their trunks on the grass beside them, and Harry reached out and put one finger on the toe of the boot, and then the familiar savage hook behind the navel, and the ground was gone. He landed badly. He always landed badly on portkeys. There was no good way to do it as far as he could tell. The whole design seemed optimized for the transport, and not for the dignity of the transported. He caught himself on one knee in long, wet grass, and straightened up and pushed his glasses back into place, and then went completely still. He knew this view. He had seen it from the boats in first year, all 40 or so first years crammed into small wooden boats on a dark lake, with Hagrid at the prow, and the castle had risen up from the water ahead of them, and somebody near Harry had breathed in sharply, and he had understood then why you crossed the lake in boats, why you arrived by water the first time. Because of this, standing in a field in the early morning, it looked different, larger, more particular. He could see details he hadn't seen from the boats, individual towers he hadn't catalogued before. The lake was silver in the September light, and the castle was above it, against a sky that hadn't quite decided on its color yet, somewhere between gray and the particular blue that came right before the sun arrived fully. He hitched his trunk strap higher and followed Dumbledore up the path. Professor McGonagall was waiting at the entrance hall. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, and her tartan robes precise in the way that everything about her was precise, and she looked at Harry first and then at Dumbledore, and her expression communicated approximately 12 distinct things while her face remained, technically. She said their trunks would be brought up. She said they would need to collect their schedules from her office after breakfast. She said this to Dumbledore, who nodded once, as though they had already had this conversation in some other register, and then she looked at Harry again and said with a slight inclination of her head, "Could he come with her for a moment?" They went a few paces down the corridor, not far enough to be properly private, but far enough that her voice wouldn't carry Mr. Potter. She looked at him directly. Her square glasses caught the light from the entrance hall's torches. Behind them, her eyes were sharp and not unkind, which was a combination she had always managed with what seemed like effortless precision. "Are you all right?" It was not quite a question in the way she said it, or it was a question that already acknowledged the difficulty of the answer, which was its own kind of consideration. Harry said yes. He meant it approximately 70% of the way, which was about as much as he could mean it right now, and something in the way she held his gaze for the moment after suggested that she received this estimate and considered it acceptable. She gave a single, brief nod. She said, "Good." Then she said, in a voice that stayed level and gave nothing away, "Welcome back." She turned and went back to Dumbledore, and Harry stood for a moment in the corridor, listening to the entrance hall come to life around him. Distantly, from somewhere above, the sound of students moving to breakfast, and thought that "welcome back" was a sentence he had heard before from various teachers. I'm in the way of teachers welcoming students back from holiday. This had not sounded like that. He could not have explained the difference, but it had not. From the upper corridor, Severus Snape watched Potter and Weasley follow the headmaster inside. He had been passing entirely by coincidence, and had paused at the high window overlooking the front steps, entirely out of interest in the morning light. And what he had seen was two boys, trunks, one snowy owl, and an absence. The absence was the important part. In his 11 years of teaching, he had developed a reliable instinct for the kind of trouble 12-year-old boys generated when left unattended, and the particular trouble he had expected Potter to generate this September, the kind that involved enchanted flying vehicles and ministry correspondence and a significant amount of his own time spent constructing consequences had not materialized. The late enrollment paperwork that had crossed his desk that morning cited a medical accommodation in a category he did not recognize. He read the form twice. The category remained unrecognized. He filed this under "requires monitoring." He continued down the corridor at the same pace. They found the common room in the late afternoon. The fat lady admitted them with an expression of deeply satisfied relief that suggested she had been told something and could not wait to watch it confirmed in person. They climbed through the portrait hole with their bags, and Hermione was there. She was standing 3 steps from the portrait hole with the specific bearing of someone who had been standing there for some time and was not going to pretend otherwise. Her bushy hair was carrying several more curls than usual, which happened when she had been thinking intensely, and she looked at them with an expression that was partially enormous relief and partially a kind of controlled urgency, as though she had been holding a very large number of words in careful reserve and was now prepared to release them in an organized fashion. She said she had been extremely worried, and she had developed several theories, and the most likely involved a deliberate obstruction charm of a kind she had read about in Curses and Countercurses, but hadn't been able to confirm because she didn't have the book here. And she had also considered the possibility of a ministry error in the barrier's maintenance schedule, which she'd looked up and which hadn't happened since 1974, and "We're fine," Ron said. Harry stayed at ours. She looked at Harry. "At the Burrow?" "Yes, for 2 days, and before that, since September 1st. She considered this for a moment, in the way she considered information that required a rapid reassessment of several prior assumptions. Then she said, "Good." She seemed to mean it very genuinely and move on from it very efficiently, which was one of the things Harry had always appreciated about her. She asked if they had their schedules. He had the round, open face of someone who found most situations slightly alarming, and he had clearly been standing in Hermione's conversational wake for the past 3 minutes and had not found a gap wide enough. He looked at Harry now and said simply that he was glad Harry was here. Harry looked at him. There was something in the way Neville said things that managed to be entirely without decoration. Not inarticulate, just uncomplicated, the way things were when they were true and didn't need argument. Harry said, "Yeah, me too." The common room settled around them. There were people who looked over, because there were always people who looked over. Because Harry was Harry, and there was a scar on his forehead that functioned as a kind of permanent announcement in rooms full of wizards. He had learned to exist alongside this in first year, to occupy the space without meeting every pair of eyes, to receive the attention without bending his shape to fit it. But standing in the Gryffindor common room in the late afternoon light with Hermione reorganizing her theory index and Ron already looking for where he'd left his copy of the Chudley Cannon's calendar, Harry noticed for the first time that mixed into the watching eyes was something different. Not the scar, not the boy who lived, just glad in the way people were glad when something had been uncertain and then was not. The distinction mattered. He couldn't have said why, not precisely. But he registered it, and it sat differently than the other kind. He wrote the letter that evening, at the small desk by the dormitory window, while Ron demonstrated for Neville the exact trajectory of the Portkey landing, and Neville listened politely and didn't point out that this was the fourth telling. He got a sheet of parchment and dipped his quill and wrote, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Weasley." He stopped. He read it back. The words looked extremely formal for people whose kitchen he had eaten dinner in every night for 2 days, whose son's room he had been sleeping in, who had, he looked at the words for a moment, and then drew a line through them. He wrote, "Dear Arthur and Molly." He looked at this for a shorter time before crossing it out. It felt presumptuous in the other direction entirely. He wasn't, they hadn't, said. He didn't know what the right word was for what had happened at the Burrow over the last 3 days, and he certainly didn't know whether first names were part of it. He stared at the blank top of the parchment for long enough that the ink on his quill began to dry. Then he wrote, "I got here safely. The castle is exactly the same. I just wanted you to know." He looked at this. He couldn't find anything wrong with it. It was true, and it said what it needed to say, which was, "I arrived. The place I was going is still here. I thought about you when I got here." He left a space at the bottom for a signature and then didn't write one, not because he couldn't think of one, but because all the options felt like they were saying something he wasn't sure how to say yet. He folded the parchment and called Hedwig from her perch. She stepped onto his wrist with the authority of an owl who always knew where she was supposed to be and extended her leg. He tied the letter on. He crossed to the window and opened it, and she was gone before he'd finished opening it, out into the September dark, south toward Devon and a kitchen where, he thought, and then didn't finish the thought, but he sent it after her anyway. He stood at the window for a while. But down on the grounds, the lake was dark, and the squid wasn't visible, and the castle was lit from within, every window yellow, the way the Burrow's kitchen window had been yellow when he'd stood on the landing in the night and listened to Arthur writing. He went to bed. 3 weeks into term, Hogwarts had reasserted itself over everything else. This was what it did. Harry had noticed it in first year too, the way the school absorbed your attention so completely, that the summers became a kind of theoretical background noise, something that had happened to a different version of you who had not yet known about transfiguration. By mid-September, he was taking notes in charms and arguing with Ron about the proper wrist movement for a specific levitation variant, and spending Tuesday evenings at Quidditch practice while the Scottish sky did whatever it wanted above him. And all of this was so deeply itself that the previous 10 years of his life occasionally seemed implausible by comparison. Percy was wearing his prefect badge with a solemn dedication that had, by the second week, become something of a creative challenge for Fred and George. Their response was a fake fainting routine, deployed every time they caught sight of the badge. A hand to the forehead, a dramatic stagger, a slow crumple to the floor, and then, from the floor, a look of rapt admiration upward. Percy's face, during these performances, was a study in the particular dignity of a person refusing to acknowledge that something is happening. Ron watched with the expression of someone who has seen this before, and finds it reliably funny anyway. The Burrow was writing 3 times a week. This was new. Harry had received letters before. Hagrid's, in July of last year, printed in enormous letters on thick paper. But he had not had regular post, had not had the particular Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday rhythm of owl arrival that announced itself by Hedwig returning with a response before the week was done. He had not had that. He had it now, and what it did to the common room was subtle and difficult to name, something like ballast, like a counterweight, the quality of a thing that made the floor more solid than it had been. Molly's letters were practical. She wrote about the garden, what it was doing in October, the last tomatoes coming in, the gnomes mounting what she described as a counter-offensive that suggested, in her word. She wrote about Arthur, who had found something in a skip near work that he had described to her for 20 minutes, and which appeared to be a rubber duck with modifications, and she didn't know what the modifications were for, and Arthur was delighted not to know. She told Harry to eat his breakfast. She told him it was cold in Scotland, and were his robes heavy enough, and if they weren't, the situation was addressable. The third letter ended with a line she had tucked in, without drawing attention to it. "We miss you here." Harry read it 4 times. He was not entirely sure what to do with it. He had been missed by Ron over summers, probably, in the abstract way that you missed your friends when they weren't around, and he had missed Ron. But this was different. This was a house that had his absence in it, that had counted him present, and now counted him temporarily absent. He had never been missed before in a way anyone had bothered to write down and send north. He put the letter in the inside pocket of his robes, next to his chest, and went to breakfast and ate it. Ginny was at the Gryffindor table with the other first years. Harry knew her from the Burrow, had known her across 2 summers, had known her as the person who appeared at the top of the stairs and then disappeared again in a process he'd only later understood was shyness, had known her as once she got comfortable, sharp and funny and extremely direct about which of her brothers she found most annoying. A list that changed composition depending on the week. She could do a perfect impression of Percy's prefect barge face. She had shown him once in the kitchen, and he'd laughed until Molly came in and asked what was wrong. At school, she was something else. She was pale in a way that wasn't quite her natural coloring. She had ink on her fingers at every meal, more than you'd expect, a darkness on her hands that suggested she had been writing for very long stretches of time. Sometimes Harry looked over at her and found her staring at nothing at all, with the expression of someone who had just surfaced from somewhere and had not quite reoriented to the room they were in. He mentioned it to Ron. Ron said she had always been a bit strange around Harry, and that it was probably just first-year nerves, and that Ginny was odd sometimes, the way everyone was odd sometimes. Harry decided this was probably it. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet, and the not knowing would last until much later, when he would look back at this conversation with the specific remorse of someone who had all the information available and had assembled it incorrectly. Halloween arrived and was not festive. Nearly Headless Nick had invited them to his Death Day party, which was held in one of the dungeons with the particular decor of a party planned by someone who had been dead for nearly 500 years and whose notion of celebration had accordingly calcified. The guests were mostly ghosts, transparent, chattering, the occasional peeves rattling through walls, and the food was designed for people without the ability to taste it. Rotten fish, moldy cake, and something that had been a fruit bowl in 1492. The stone was cold, the decorations were the absence of light. Harry stood with Ron and Hermione in the middle of it, and thought that this was the most comprehensive Halloween he'd ever experienced, in the sense that it seemed to have extracted every warm or interesting element the holiday contained. They stayed because Nick asked them to stay, and because saying no to a ghost who had just sung a speech about the 500th anniversary of his botched beheading was more difficult than it should have been in theory. By the time they left, Harry was thinking about nothing except how quickly they could get back to the tower. The corridor on the way up was the wrong kind of quiet. And not the quiet of a castle after hours, which was deep and familiar, a narrower quiet, the kind that collected in the space between something having happened and someone having found it. Harry noticed it before he understood it, and then he heard the caretaker's shout echoing off the stone ahead of them, and then they turned the corner. The cat was suspended by her tail from a torch bracket, rigid, her eyes blank and filmed. Alive, he thought, looking at her, but only in the technical sense, only in the sense of still breathing, whatever breathing meant for a petrified creature. And above her on the wall, in something red and gleaming and not quite dry, the Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air. Beware. Students were gathering behind them. A prefect was calling for people to move back. Someone near Harry said it was blood. Someone else said it wasn't. Tea. Neither of them seemed certain of anything except that their voice was still working, and they were using it, because using it was better than standing in the silence that the writing created. Harry stood at the edge of the crowd and read the message again and felt the night change around him, in a way he could not name precisely, but would remember specifically. Not fear, not quite. He had felt fear before and knew its particular texture. Something under fear. Something that recognized, quietly and without drama, that the school he had just been beginning to call safe had a different thing moving inside it. Something that had been moving before he arrived and would continue moving on its own schedule, and could not be reasoned with, or run at, or fixed by knowing which staircase creaked. He was still thinking about this when they were sent back to their houses by a professor who materialized from somewhere with the petrification countermeasures protocol and a face that gave nothing useful away, and it was not until he and Ron were alone in the stairwell, Hermione having gone ahead, that Harry stopped walking. There was a sound in the wall. He had heard something. He wasn't entirely certain when. Maybe before the crowd, maybe after, maybe somewhere in the corridor between the dungeon and the scene on the 5th floor. A hiss and slide, low and continuous. The kind of thing that had a shape, if you could hear it from close enough. Not quite words, almost words. The way you could almost hear the lyrics of a song coming from another room where you couldn't catch them but you knew they were there. He said, "There's something in the wall." Ron stopped. "What?" "I heard something. When we were just now in the corridor, a kind of hissing." Ron's expression shifted. Not alarm exactly. Something more careful than alarm, something more precise. He said, "Harry." "Yeah." "Did you?" Ron stopped. Tried again. "Could you understand it?" Harry looked at him. He hadn't asked himself that question. He had heard the sound and registered it as sound, and not yet turned the register over to see what was on the other side of it. He turned it over. He didn't answer immediately. Ron waited, very still, in a way. Ron was not always still, in the way of someone who needed the answer to land before he responded to it. "I think so," Harry said. "Maybe I don't. I'm not sure." Ron was quiet for a long moment. "Right," he said finally, in a voice carefully assembled to sound like right. They went up to the tower. Neither of them slept well. In the morning, neither of them said anything else about it, and the silence had the quality of a thing being held carefully by both hands until they could work out what to do with it. Arthur had been making inquiries. Not in the way that generated forms in triplicate and attracted the attention of colleagues, who would then have feelings about it that Arthur would have to manage in corridor conversations for the rest of the year, quietly. Through the right channels, via the right people, with the specific patience of a man who had spent 20 years at the ministry and understood the difference between the way things were supposed to work and the way things actually worked, and who had long since made his peace with navigating both simultaneously. What he discovered over 3 careful weeks of inquiries was that wizarding guardianship law was porous in some directions and completely rigid in others, and the porosity and the rigidity were not always where you expected them. The Dursleys held legal Muggle guardianship, had held it since 1981, established under Muggle law and registered with the relevant Muggle authorities in the London Borough of Surrey. The wizarding world, in its practical wisdom, tended to recognize Muggle guardianship instruments for children raised in Muggle households. The logic was sound. If a Muggle-raised child had Muggle legal guardians, the wizarding apparatus did not require the duplication. Efficient, reasonable. The issue was that Harry Potter was not Muggle-raised in any meaningful sense after the age of 11. He had been Muggle-raised in the sense of having been physically resident in a Muggle household, but a Muggle household was not a Muggle-raised life, if what happened inside it was. Arthur stopped and made himself finish the thought. If what happened inside it was what he had heard Molly describe and had read in the room himself that first afternoon. There was a petition process through the Wizengamot's Family Services branch. It was not used often. It required documentation of the petitioner's circumstances, financial statement, character testimony, and the signature of a ministry official who was willing to certify that the petition was made in good faith. Arthur had the documentation. He had the financial statement, which was honest about the constraints, and which he was not ashamed of. He had the character testimony from several people he trusted, and from Dumbledore, whose signature on a ministry document had a specific effect on how quickly that document moved through the review process. On the 30th of October, Molly Weasley turned 43. This was not, she had decided some years ago, a number requiring ceremony. It was a good number, capable and functional, containing all the experience of 42 and adding 1 further year of acquired knowledge to the total. Arthur gave her a cup of tea at breakfast and a small wrapped box that turned out to contain a new hand for the family clock. The clock was the kind of thing that had been in the kitchen so long it had become invisible, which was what happened with objects that told you what you needed to know every time you glanced at them. She had the hands for Arthur and all 6 children, Percy, Bill, Charlie, the twins, Ron, and now Ginny, who had been the last addition, and whose hand had worried her every September when it shifted from home to Hogwarts. And she expected this would not change until she was dead, and possibly not even then. She held the new hand in her palm and looked at it for a moment. It was blank, unregistered, waiting to be tied to a person. She got out the registration kit from the drawer by the sink and sat down at the kitchen table and worked through the charm sequence without thinking about it much, because her hands knew the sequence the way they knew most things she did in this kitchen. When she was done, she set the hand against the clock face and watched it settle, and then she watched it swing. Hogwarts. She sat for a moment and looked at it. The hand was the same size as the others, slotted in between Ron's and Ginny's, reading Hogwarts in the same small letters. She had not thought, when she started, about what it would look like finished. She thought about it now, the 8 hands, the 8 locations, the way the clock told her at any given moment exactly where the people she loved were, as if that were simply information she needed as a matter of course. And the thought she had was, yes, that is the right place for him to be. She got up and put the registration kit away and wrote the week's shopping list, and did not make a production of it. Colin Creevey was petrified on a Tuesday in November, and Harry found out at breakfast. The rumor moved through the Gryffindor table the way rumors always moved, from the end closest to the portrait hole where it had arrived first, outward in both directions, until it reached everyone more or less simultaneously, and left a wake of lowered voices and the specific unhappy silence of people deciding how to feel about something. Harry heard it from Seamus, who had it from Dean, who had it from a third year, whose name Harry didn't know. He had liked Colin. This was the thing he kept returning to while the table settled into its uneasy recalibration. Colin's enthusiasm had been the kind that was genuinely exhausting. You had to manage it, like a natural force, something that would run itself into everything if not gently redirected, but it was real, which was rarer than you would think, and it was kind. And Colin had never once looked at Harry with the particular, calculating assessment of someone trying to figure out what he was worth. He had just been pleased that Harry was there. It was a simple thing, and Harry had found it useful. He looked down the table. Ginny was sitting 3 seats away, her ink-stained fingers wrapped around her fork, not eating. She was looking at the surface of the table. As Harry watched, someone spoke to her, and she looked up with a delay, a half-second. That was the delay of someone returning from somewhere. And then her face arranged itself into something that was supposed to be. He was beginning to think he understood what he was seeing. He didn't have a name for it yet. He told Ron that afternoon, in the corner of the common room where the chairs were least comfortable and therefore most reliably uninhabited. He described it in a list, which was the way he knew how to describe things he had been watching for a while and wanted to say accurately. The pallor. Not ordinary first-year pallor, not the pallor of someone homesick or cold, but the pallor of someone whose blood wasn't quite reaching their face at the right rate, the ink on her hands at every meal, the way she flinched when someone appeared in her peripheral vision without warning, a small startle that she suppressed quickly. The way she looked when she looked at nothing, that unfocused, suspended expression, like someone whose eyes were transmitting an image nobody was home to receive. Ron listened with his arms folded and his face doing the complicated work of someone who did not want to hear what he was hearing and could not find a reason to stop hearing it. "She's always been a bit odd," he said, when Harry finished. "This is different." "How do you know what's different?" "You've known her for 2 summers. This was true. Harry considered it. "I know," he said. She's not behaving like herself. She's behaving like someone doing an impression of herself." Ron was quiet. He unfolded his arms, folded them again, looked at the fire. "She's been writing a lot," he said eventually, in the reluctant tone of someone confirming information rather than volunteering it. "Letters, I think. Or, I don't know. She hasn't been sending much through the owls. But her hands are always—" "Yeah." They sat with this for a moment. "We should watch," Harry said. "We've been watching. We should watch more carefully. And tell someone, maybe, if it gets worse." Ron nodded, in the way he nodded when he agreed with something and wasn't ready to talk further about agreeing. They both looked at the fire for a while. The common room moved around them, Quidditch arguments and transfiguration disputes, and neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't make it more real, and making it more real was a decision you couldn't unmake. Hedwig arrived at dinner 2 days later. Harry saw her first, recognized the white of her coming through the high windows, and reached up and unclipped the letter from her leg before she'd fully settled on his shoulder. She nipped his ear anyway, in the way of an owl who considered punctuality its own reward. He recognized the handwriting before he'd unfolded it. Arthur's careful script, slightly more deliberate than usual, the kind of handwriting that happened when someone was writing something they wanted to get right. He wrote that the petition had been filed. He wrote that these things moved slowly and that patience was required, but that the right people were now aware of the situation and that the appropriate office had confirmed receipt. He wrote about a Muggle device called a fax machine that he had encountered at work, and which he described in 3 careful sentences that suggested he found it genuinely extraordinary. And then at the end, before he signed his name, he and Molly wanted Harry to know. And he had written this line very plainly, without preamble, which was Arthur's way of signaling that a thing was important, that whatever the ministry decided about the formal process, and that it would not change. Harry read this line once. He read it again. He folded the letter along its creases with the care of someone handling something that might not fold back correctly if he wasn't precise about it, and he put it in his pocket. Ron watched him across the table and didn't ask. Harry picked up his fork and finished dinner. The burrow at Christmas was a different creature entirely. Harry had known the burrow in September, quiet and deliberate, 3 people at the kitchen table, and a clock with 8 hands, and the particular quality of a house that usually ran full and was currently running well below capacity. He had known it in the abstract through letters, the garden, the gnomes, Arthur's rubber duck with modifications. But he had not known it like this. All 6 children home, every room at its intended pitch, the smell of Molly's cooking moving through all 3 floors, and the particular noise of a family that knew exactly how to irritate each other. He knew things now. That was the strange part, the part that sat at the edge of his attention and made him careful. He knew which step creaked, the 3rd from the top, which he navigated by automatic rerouting every time his foot went up the stairs. He knew which twin would agree with you to set something up, and which one would argue first and come around later, which took longer but was more honest. He knew that Percy's prefect badge pomposity was at least half a performance, a structure Percy wore the way other people wore formal clothes, and that when he forgot he was performing it, you got glimpses of someone who was genuinely clever and worked very hard at things he cared about and did not know how to say so. He knew the look on Molly's face, a particular angle of the chin, and an assessment of the kitchen's current state that meant you had approximately 3 minutes before you were handed something to chop or peel or stir, and that the correct response was not to evade it. He knew all of this, and it felt not like knowledge exactly. It felt like the way a house felt when you stopped moving through it like a guest and started moving through it like someone who lived there. It felt like something he wanted. He had never been especially good at wanting things. The Dursleys had trained that reflex out of him with some efficiency, and he had supplemented the training himself, because wanting things you could not have was a waste of attention, and attention was a limited resource. He was 12 years old, and he had never wanted a house before, and the wanting sat in his chest like a question he was afraid to ask too directly. The owl arrived on Christmas morning, while everyone was still in their pajamas. Harry saw the ministry seal before he read the name on the outside, because the seal was not something you could miss. A large official circle in dark green wax, the ministry emblem pressed into it, the kind of seal that came on documents that required your attention, whether or not you wanted to give it. His name was on the outside in formal bureaucratic script, and his stomach did the thing it did when something official happened that he had not been expecting. He read it twice. He was requested, the letter was careful about the word requested, to appear before a hearing of the Weisengamots Family Services Division on the 28th of December 1992 at 10 o'clock in the morning to provide testimony in the matter of formal magical guardianship transfer. He was not required to bring a solicitor, but was welcome to do so. He was not under investigation. The nature of the hearing was civil, not criminal. He was not being arrested. He was being asked. This distinction seemed, in theory, like it should make a significant difference. It was, making less difference than he would have liked. Across the room, Molly caught his expression from the kitchen doorway and said nothing, which meant she already knew. He couldn't sleep on the 27th. He came downstairs at something like 5 in the morning and found Arthur already at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a copy of the Wizengamot Family Services Procedural Guidelines, which was the kind of document Arthur had been sleeping fewer hours than usual over for the past 2 months. He looked up when Harry appeared in the doorway and seemed entirely unsurprised to see him, in the way of a man who had expected this and had put out an extra cup. Harry sat down. Arthur poured tea. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was a quality of silence that Arthur was good at. Companionable, unhurried, the silence of someone who would wait until you were ready and genuinely intended to be there when that happened. "Tell me what it is," Arthur said. "They're going to ask me things. In front of everyone. They will. Yes, it's not adversarial. The chamber isn't set up for argument. In a family hearing, they're not trying to catch you in something. The Wizengamots Family Services Division exists to establish what is in the best interest of the child, and in order to do that, they need to know what the child says." He turned his cup in his hands. Harry looked at the table. "What do I say?" "You tell them the truth." A pause. The kitchen was very quiet. That particular 4 in the morning quiet that existed nowhere else, where the clock was the only thing moving and the outside world hadn't started yet. What if the truth is that I don't? "What I want," Harry said. Arthur looked at his tea for a moment. Then he said, "That is also a kind of answer." He said it without judgment, in the way of someone telling you a fact about the geography of the territory, rather than a comment on your preparedness for it. You don't have to know everything you want. You only have to say what's true. Harry nodded. He picked up his tea. They sat in the kitchen until the sky outside the window began to change color, and Arthur told him about the procedural sequence. What would happen first, who would speak, when Harry would be asked to sit in the chair, and by the end of it the telling had done something to the shape of the day, had given it edges, had made it a thing he could walk toward, rather than something formless that was waiting to happen to him. The chamber was underground. Harry had expected something like a courtroom, had expected something like what he knew of Muggle courtrooms from television, with wooden galleries and a judge's bench and the particular staginess of formal proceedings. What he got was larger and older than that, with stone walls that curved in a way that suggested they predated the concept of straight lines, and tiered stone benches, forming a semicircle around a single chair in the center, and light that seemed to come from somewhere other than torches. The gallery was perhaps a third, full 50 plum-robed witches and wizards, occupying perhaps 16 of their seats, which meant the room was acoustically much larger than its attendance implied. Dumbledore was in the presiding chair, which was the chair at the apex of the semicircle, and which was, Harry noticed, the only chair in the room that was the right size for anyone. All the other chairs seemed to have been built for people who had more certainty about where to put their limbs. Harry's chair was in the center of the room, which was not a position that made you feel unobserved. He sat in it. He put his hands on his knees. He kept his shoulders level in the way that meant, "I am not frightened," rather than in the way that meant, "I am not frightened, and it is working." Dumbledore opened the hearing with several formal sentences about its purpose and nature, none of which Harry had to respond to. Then there was a brief period in which Arthur, sitting in the gallery with Molly at his left side, was asked to confirm the contents of the petition. He confirmed them. A witch, 3 rows up in plum and silver robes, wrote something on her clipboard. Several other members of the gallery looked at Harry with the evaluative attention of people whose job was to determine things about other people, and Harry looked back at them with the expression he had developed over 12 years for situations in which looking back was the only tool available. Then Dumbledore looked at him. "Mr. Potter," he said, in a voice he used for things that mattered, "the petition before this chamber concerns your guardianship. Before we proceed, I would ask you to speak to your own situation as you understand it, what has occurred, and what you would wish to occur. In your own words, without procedural form. The chamber is listening." Harry looked at the stone floor for a moment. He said the Dursleys had not wanted him. This was not a complaint, it was simply a fact, like the temperature of the room or the number of rows in the gallery. He had lived at Privet Drive for 10 years, and in that time, the clearest information he had received about his status in that house was that his presence in it was a problem to be managed. He said this not because he wanted anyone to be sorry for him, but because it seemed like the relevant context. He said, the Weasleys did want him. He was not entirely certain how to talk about this part, so he talked about it in terms of what he had learned. He said he had learned which stair creaked. He said he had learned the look that meant the kitchen needed help in 3 minutes. He said he had received letters 3 times a week from a woman he had known for a year and a half, who wrote about her garden and told him to eat his breakfast. And he had read one line of one letter 4 times, because it said, "We miss you here." And he had not known before that letter what it felt like to be missed, in a way that someone had taken the trouble to write down. He said he had never understood before what it felt like when people wanted him there. He would like, if it was permitted, to find out. He stopped. Somewhere in the gallery, the witch in plum robes wrote something. The scratch of her quill was the only sound in the room. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. Then he nodded once, very slightly, in the way he had of nodding that was less about agreement and more about received. The parchment was 3 pages. Molly read it in the corridor outside the chamber while the procedural secretary who had brought it waited, with the patient expression of someone who did this regularly. Provisional guardianship, 6-month review. Sit-in. Conditions of transfer. Ongoing school enrollment, stable domicile, no impediment to the child's development and well-being. Signature required on the 3rd page twice, in the spaces marked in pale blue. She had known, since the night at King's Cross, that she was going to sign whatever needed signing. She had known it before, that in the way you knew things before they had names, when Dumbledore said we need to contact him, and she had said, I know, and she had already meant we are keeping him, she had already meant whatever the word is that comes after keeping. She took the quill from the procedural secretary and signed. She felt it in her wrist when the quill moved. Not a spell, just the weight of the instrument, the drag of ink on parchment, the way a name felt when you were putting it on something that was going to be true afterward. 7 children, she thought. The thought rose and resolved in the same moment. 8. She handed the parchment back. She capped the quill. Arthur put his hand on the small of her back, not to steady her. She was entirely steady, but in the way of someone acknowledging that a thing had just happened. She nodded once. She went to find Harry. He heard it in January, on a night when he had stayed in the library too late and was making his way back through the 2nd floor, with the particular hurried quiet of someone who was not technically breaking any rules, but was aware that the hour complicated any defense of that position. The corridor near the girls' bathroom was empty. The torches had been banked low, and the shadows between them were long and uncertain, and Harry was moving quickly enough that he almost missed it. Almost. It was a sound that lived at the edge of sounds, just below the range where you would call it a sound, rather than a feeling. a low, continuous pressure on the ears that had a shape to it without having words. He had heard it before, on Halloween in the stairwell. He stopped. This time it was different. This time he understood it, not in the way he understood English, not meaning arriving through his ears and assembling into sentences. It was more like the way you understood that someone was angry before they'd said anything, the understanding that lived in the body before the mind had caught up. The thing in the wall was moving. It was moving upward from somewhere very deep, and it was following something, a pull or a call that he could not hear the source of, only the effect. It was hungry. That part was not metaphor. It was the simplest and most direct thing he had understood in a long time. Hunger without object. The hunger of something that had been waiting and was no longer only waiting. He stood absolutely still in the dark corridor and listened until the sound moved past and faded, and he did not breathe much while this was happening. Then he went, not to Gryffindor Tower, but up. Dumbledore's office was at the top of a spiral staircase, accessed through a stone gargoyle who moved aside when Harry said the password, which he knew because Dumbledore had given it to him in September, phrased as casually as a thing could be phrased while still being unmistakably an invitation. He had not used it until now. The staircase rotated slowly as he climbed, and the door at the top was already open a precise inch, which told him he was expected. The office was lit warmly and full of the sounds of instruments Harry had never been able to name, small silver objects on spindle legs that moved and clicked and emitted occasional thin plumes of smoke in colors that did not appear in the standard spectrum. A large bird on a perch near the window watched Harry enter with liquid amber eyes. Dumbledore was sitting at his desk, and he gestured to the chair opposite with the unhurried motion of someone who had been waiting in the particular way of not waiting that he had perfected. Harry sat down. He described what he had heard. He described it carefully in the order it had happened. The corridor, the sound, the understanding of it, the nature of what he'd understood. He tried to be precise about the parts he was less certain of, and clear about the parts he was certain of. Dumbledore listened without interrupting, which was something Harry had noticed about him. He listened the way other people did not, as though the words coming in were more important than any words he was preparing to send out. His eyes, which were very blue and never, especially still, went still while Harry talked. When Harry finished, Dumbledore sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked 2 questions. Direction of travel, had it been moving toward him or away, and from which direction? Speed, fast or slow, constant or varying? Harry answered both as accurately as he could. Dumbledore wrote something down, 3 or 4 words, on a piece of parchment, and looked at it. "You have done the right thing," he said, "in coming here." Directly and immediately. "I thought about not," Harry said. "I know." Dumbledore looked at him with the expression he had for facts. He found significant, and you came anyway. That is what matters. He set his quill down and folded his hands on the desk in the way of a man arriving at a sentence he wanted to say correctly. "I will investigate what you have heard. I ask that you not go looking for it on your own." "All right. I mean this seriously, Harry. Not because I doubt your capacity to be useful, but because what you have described is not a thing that rewards curiosity in small corridors." Something in his expression shifted, organized itself into something more precise and less readable. It was the expression of someone managing a large and frightening fort very carefully. Harry would recognize it later, much later, as the look of fear. Not panic. Dumbledore's version of fear was nothing so obvious. It was fear held under very close professional control, which made it, if anything, more alarming than the uncontrolled kind, Harry said he understood. He meant it. February arrived in the way of months that arrive when you have been dreading them, which was to say, with complete indifference to your feelings about the matter. Ron had been watching Ginny for weeks. He had started doing it the way you started, any sustained observation, with a theory you expected to disprove, monitoring the data until it stopped being worrying and started being explicable. By February, the data had not become explicable, it had become worse. She was not sleeping. This was not inference. He could see it in her face at breakfast, the specific grayness that accumulated under eyes that had been closed for fewer hours than they needed. She was not eating at every meal, not in the way of someone who had lost their appetite, but in the way of someone who had lost track of whether they had an appetite, who looked down at their plate and seemed genuinely surprised by its existence. She had stopped sending owls home. This was the thing that Ron found most alarming because Ginny was, at baseline, the most enthusiastic correspondent in the family. She wrote home twice a week when she remembered, and 3 times when she didn't, long looping letters about lessons and the castle and the things Fred and George had done that she found either appalling or secretly funny. And the line between those two categories had always been thin. The owls had stopped. Molly had sent a query by return post that arrived with the specific energy of a woman who had noticed and was not pleased about it, and Ginny had written back once, briefly, in an unfamiliar hand. Ron sat at the Gryffindor table and watched his sister 3 seats away staring at her dinner with the expression she had been wearing for weeks, that unmoored look, that quality of being present in a room while something else occupied most of the available person, and he tried to remember the last time she had looked like herself. He could not remember. He found Harry, after dinner, in the corridor outside the Great Hall. And he said, "Something is wrong with her." He said it in the flat voice of someone who had been holding the sentence back for long enough that it had become simple. Really wrong, not first-year nerves, and not just missing home. Something is wrong with her, and I think you know what I'm talking about. Harry said, "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." Ron said, "We have to do something." Harry said, "I know, but I'm not sure what." Hermione had been in the library for 2 weeks, which was normal, except that she had been in the library for 2 weeks, specifically in the restricted section, with a permission slip she had obtained from Professor McGonagall on grounds she described as personal academic interest, which was not normal at all. She brought her notes to them in the dormitory on a Thursday evening with the expression of someone who had found the answer to a question and did not entirely like having found it. She spread 3 sheets of parchment on Ron's bed and said she needed them to listen carefully and not panic, because the useful response to the information she was about to give them was not panic. She had found what was doing the petrifications. It was a basilisk. She explained what a basilisk was with the thorough efficiency of someone who had spent 2 weeks learning to explain it and had organized the information by order of importance. A serpent of legendary size, capable of living for 1,000 years or more, its gaze, direct, was lethal, which was why no one had died. Every victim had encountered it, through an intermediary, an image, or a reflection, or a surface. It lived in the pipes. She had found 3 separate cross-references to a large serpent moving through the school's plumbing in accounts that dated back 300 years, and the school's plumbing all connected to the same original network, which connected to the chamber. Then she said, "The roosters." She said it carefully, because she had not been sure how to frame this part, the part that required assembling inference rather than citation. Roosters crowing was fatal to a basilisk. Everyone who kept roosters near the castle had reported them dying over several months. Beginning in September, something had needed those roosters dead. The basilisk, or whoever was controlling it, had arranged for them to be gone before the attacks began. Nobody spoke for a moment. Ron said, "How old did you say it was?" Hermione said, "Approximately 1,000 years old." Ron said something unrepeatable and quietly, and Harry thought, "Yes, exactly." He wrote the letter home that night. He sat at the desk in the dormitory with 3 sheets of parchment and a quill, and wrote 3 different openings, each of which he abandoned for the same reason. He had started saying something true, and the true thing had led in 3 sentences, and the larger true thing was that there was a 1,000-year-old serpent in the pipes below the school, and he had heard it, and it was looking for something to hurt, and Ginny was not well, and the diary was probably responsible for all of it. He stared at the 3rd abandoned opening for a while. He thought about what had changed between September and now what was different about writing a letter home when there was a person waiting for it. The specific difference, not abstract, but practical, was that the person on the other end of the letter would do something with what he told her. She would do something because that was what she did, that was the shape of her, the thing she moved through the world with, and he had gone to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore was handling it, and there was nothing Molly could do from Devon that would not make things more complicated and less safe. And so the thing he was protecting was not himself. It wasn't hiding, the old reflex, the way he'd gotten quiet at the Dursleys. It was her. He was protecting her from worries she could not use. The distinction felt important. He wrote about January cold, which had been extraordinary. He wrote about the Quidditch match coming up and the ongoing debate about strategy that he and Ron were having. He signed it Harry. Then, before he sealed it, he read it back and added one more line at the bottom. "I am fine, really." He put it away and looked at the words. He meant them in the way that it was possible to mean things under complicated circumstances, not as the whole truth, but as the part of the truth that was true and that someone who cared about him needed to know. He was fine. He was not alone. He had told Dumbledore. These 3 things were true, and they were the ones that mattered. He sealed the letter and called Hedwig from her perch. She took it without complaint and was gone through the window before he'd finished the thought he was having, which was, this is what having someone to protect feels like. It felt like a weight, and it felt like something else, something in the same location as the weight, but different from it entirely, something that had no word in any language he knew. He sat at the desk for a while and looked at the window where she had been. Then he went to bed. Ron's birthday was the 1st of March, which meant that Harry had been planning since January. This was not how Harry typically operated. He had not in the years before Hogwarts been someone to whom birthdays were a significant occasion, for the obvious reason that his own birthday had not been one, and it was difficult to develop conviction about the ritual importance of something that nobody in your household had ever remembered on purpose. He had been to a grand total of 2 birthday celebrations in his life before the age of 12, both Dudleys, neither of which had been designed with his participation in mind. What he knew about birthdays, practically speaking, was that they required advance planning and a thing, and that the thing mattered, and that getting it wrong was worse than not trying. He had thought about it carefully, which was the thing you did when you were not sure of the conventions, but were sure of the person. He had very little confident understanding of what he was permitted to spend from his vault at Gringotts. The vault existed, he knew its number. He had been in it once, and the concept of having money in it still felt faintly theoretical, in the way that things felt theoretical when they had been true for less than 2 years. He wasn't going to make a large gesture. Something small and specific and right was better than something expensive and uncertain. He found it through a catalogue that Hermione had, which she had received from a shop in Hogsmeade that handled specialist items for Quidditch followers, and he ordered it by owl in late January, and it arrived in the first week of February, and he put it away in his trunk and did not tell Ron. He gave it to Ron at breakfast on the 1st of March. He put it on the table next to the marmalade without ceremony, because making a ceremony of it would have made Ron uncomfortable, and Ron's comfort was the point. Ron looked at it. His expression went through several stages rapidly: recognition, then a complicated gratitude that he managed quickly, so it didn't become a thing that needed addressing. And then he looked at it again more carefully. "That's," he said, "the wrong color." "Yeah." Ron looked at Harry. Harry looked back with a face that communicated nothing specifically. "You got me the wrong color on purpose. I cannot confirm that." "It's completely the wrong." Ron stopped, looked at it again. Something shifted in his expression, reorganizing itself into the thing it had been heading toward all along, which was, "This is funny, actually. You did that deliberately." "I cannot confirm or deny, Harry. Happy birthday." Ron sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of someone organizing a large feeling into a manageable package. And then he said, without looking back down, "You know, you're actually part of this family now, right? Like, properly. It's not a temporary thing." Harry looked at the table. "I know. You don't always act like you know. You sometimes act like you're waiting for someone to come and correct an administrative error. I know. So stop doing that." Ron said it without heat, the way you said things that were true and that you had been waiting to say for long enough, that the waiting had taken the edge off. "Nobody's correcting anything. It's done. It's done." He looked back at the wrong-colored object on the table between them and picked it up. "I'm keeping this, by the way, because it's the wrong color, and that means every time I look at it I'm going to be annoyed, which is clearly what you were going for." "That was entirely the goal," Harry said. Ron laughed. It was the laugh he had when something had genuinely reached him, and Harry had been aiming for exactly that. The owl from Egypt arrived 3 days later. Harry saw it come through the high windows of the great hall at breakfast. A large, tawny bird, unfamiliar, carrying a letter stamped with something Harry didn't recognize at first, and then identified as a foreign postmark. It landed in front of him with the slightly aggrieved manner of a bird that had flown a very long way and was prepared to accept acknowledgement of this fact. The envelope had sand in the crease. Not much, just a fine pale scatter along the fold, the kind of residue that came from a letter written somewhere that had a lot of sand in it and didn't apologize for that. Harry's name was on the outside in handwriting he didn't know. Long, more looping than Arthur's careful script or Molly's brisk pen, with the loose confidence of someone who wrote quickly and meant all of it. Bill Weasley wrote that he had heard there was a new member of the family. He wrote that he had thought he ought to introduce himself, given that being the eldest meant that technically Harry had to listen to him, but that he promised not to be insufferable about it, unlike certain people whose prefect badge he would not name, but who had been insufferable about things since 1983. He wrote, "Welcome to the chaos." He wrote that the chaos was extremely good chaos, and that Harry would find it exhausting, and that in his experience there was no better kind. He wrote a postscript about a tomb he was working on in the Valley of the Kings that contained a jinx he had not seen before, and which was, he said, genuinely exciting, and he described it in 2 sentences that suggested he had a great deal more to say about it and was restraining himself out of consideration for Harry's available attention. Harry read it twice. He put it in the inside pocket of his robes with Arthur's letter. The pocket had 3 things in it now. Arthur's careful letter from November, the folded note from Molly that said "We miss you here," And this one, with its Egyptian stamp and its sand and its longer looping handwriting. He pressed his hand flat against the pocket for a moment, over his robes, the way you did when you were checking that something was still there. Then he ate his breakfast. Severus Snape had received the petition through his ministry contacts in early February. It was public record, filed, stamped, and entered into the Wizengamot Register in December, accessible to anyone who knew which form to request from which clerk in which subdepartment of the Family Services Division. He had known which form and which clerk for 16 years. The document arrived on his desk on a Thursday morning, and he read it with the particular quality of attention he brought to documents that contained things he had been half expecting and was not entirely prepared to find confirmed. Arthur Weasley's handwriting was, even under official compression, recognizably careful. The petition was thorough, more thorough than Snape had expected from a man whose primary expertise ran to enchanted Muggle bric-a-brac, and it made its case in the patient, well-sourced language of someone who had been drafting and redrafting it for weeks. Molly Weasley's counter-signature was neat and immediate, the signature of someone who had not needed to think about whether to sign. Dumbledore's character testimony was a single page that said, efficiently, everything that needed saying. Harry Potter's testimony was half a page. Snape read it once. He put it down, he picked it up and read it again. The boy had said he would like, if it was permitted, to find out. He set the parchment on his desk and looked at it for a moment. He thought about the September term, how Potter had come through the entrance hall with the headmaster, on schedule, enrolled correctly, in the way of someone who had been guided rather than stumbling in on his own initiative. He thought about how Potter moved through the corridors now versus how he had moved through them last year. Last year, there had been the arrogance of novelty. Not James Potter's arrogance exactly, though the resemblance was there in the jaw, the hair, the complete failure to be invisible, but something newer, the arrogance of a person who has just discovered the world has a place for them in it and is still surprised by it. That was gone. What had replaced it was something Snape found considerably more inconvenient, which was steadiness. The boy was moving through the castle with the bearing of someone who had somewhere to be, and people who expected him. That was not a small thing. He had not had that before. He filed the petition under the relevant section of his records. He noted in his own private index, the one that contained his accounting of threats to Harry Potter, which he maintained with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, and did not discuss with anyone, that the blood charm was definitively gone. Harry was less protected than he had been. This did not simplify Snape's job. If anything, the boy, having a settled and functional domestic situation, made him marginally harder to surveil from a distance, because people with stable homes were less predictably lonely than people without them, and the lonely were easier to keep in sight. He would need to watch more carefully. Not less. He was already watching. In early March, on an afternoon when the light arrived over the Scottish hills at an angle that suggested winter was not entirely finished, but was at least considering its position, Harry walked down to the lake. He had no particular reason to be there. He had finished his Transfiguration essay, and his Charms Practical was not until Thursday, and Ron was playing Exploding Snap in the common room with Seamus, and the afternoon had arrived with the specific quality of an afternoon that was not accounted for. He sat on a rock at the edge of the lake and watched the water move. He let himself want things. This was not something he had much practice at. He had spent 12 years developing a refined ability to want things at a distance, to observe the shape of what he didn't have without moving toward it, to identify a lack without naming it, to understand that wanting was a kind of exposure and exposure was a kind of risk, and risk was something you managed rather than welcomed. He had been very good at this. It had been useful. He was trying to be less good at it. He wanted to go home to the burrow at the end of the school year. Not as a guest, not with the part of his mind that was always doing the calculation about when he would have to leave, but as someone who lived there, someone who knew the third step and the kitchen and the clock with 8 hands, and whose name was on one of those hands in a small script that said Hogwarts. There, he wanted to have a Christmas that was not borrowed. He wanted to know, without calculating the probability of it, that the people in the house would be glad to see him when he walked in. He wanted someone to tell him to eat his breakfast and mean it as an expression of love. This was a thing he had never expected to want and had been wanting since the first letter arrived. The water changed color from silver to grey to the particular dark that water went in Scotland when the sun gave up on it for the evening. The squid moved somewhere below the surface. He could see the faint disturbance of it, the shape of something large and unbothered. He watched it for a while, then he went back inside. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning and was, in Minerva McGonagall's considered opinion, one of the most comprehensively offensive documents she had ever been required to hold in her hands. She counted them twice in the entrance hall, standing very still, with the parchment flat between her palms as though stillness might prevent the words from being as true as they appeared to be. Lucius Malfoy's name was at the top in a hand that managed to communicate aristocratic certainty even through the medium of ink on parchment, and the 11 names beneath his were arranged in a descending order of enthusiasm. The letter demanded the suspension of Albus Dumbledore as headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, pending investigation of the school's management during the Chamber of Secrets attacks. It cited the number of petrifications. It cited the students still in the hospital wing. It cited the failure to identify the threat, the failure to prevent its continuation, and the failure, and this was the sentence that made her jaw tighten, to a degree she found undignified, to prioritize student safety above institutional reputation. She went upstairs. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, which meant he had known she was coming, and his expression was one she had known for 40 years. The expression of a man who has been expecting news of this kind and has been preparing his response to it. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it with the attention of someone looking for any sign that he was going to react in a way that matched the situation. There was no such sign. "I see," he said. "I will cooperate with the governor's request, Minerva." She had known he would say this. She had known it since the moment she read the first line of the letter, and knowing it had not made hearing it any easier. She had 3 things she wanted to say about it, and she ordered them by importance, and said the first, "There is an active threat inside this castle." "Yes, and you intend to leave." "I intend to cooperate," he said, with a precision she found at that moment actively maddening, which is not quite the same thing as leaving, though it will look like it from the outside. He looked at the letter in his hands again, and something in his expression shifted, became more careful, more specific. "The final attack is close. I believe the diary's hold on Ginny Weasley is reaching its completion, and when it does, the chamber will have its intended victim." He looked at her. "I am making arrangements before I go. Things are in motion that I cannot stop from outside, but I am not leaving unprepared." "What arrangements?" "Harry Potter knows more than most. He came to me in January." A brief pause that contained, she understood, something very large. "I have told him to come to you if he cannot come to me. I am trusting you to be there when that happens." She held his gaze for a moment. 40 years of knowing this man, and she still occasionally found herself confronting the specific frustration of understanding that he was right about something she was not ready to agree was right. "I will protect the students," she said. "I know you will," he said. "That is why I am able to cooperate with the governors and not simply refuse." She took the letter back. She went downstairs. She did not, on her way down, allow her face to do anything she would have to manage later. Harry had not known Dumbledore was leaving until he saw him in the entrance hall with a travelling cloak and a bag, and the particular quality of settled calm that a person had when they had decided something and were not going to be argued out of it. He stopped on the stairs. Dumbledore was crossing toward the front doors, accompanied by a woman Harry didn't recognize who appeared to be a ministry official of some kind, and for a moment Harry thought he was simply going to walk past, was going to leave, and that would be all. The way adults left when the situation required it, and you were not the person whose understanding of the situation was required. Dumbledore stopped. He turned and looked at Harry on the stairs with those blue eyes that paid complete attention, and then he walked back, unhurriedly, and stood below him, so that they were at approximately the same height, which Harry understood was not accidental. He spoke quietly. He said, if something happened, and Harry could not come to him, go to McGonagall. She would know what to do. He was not going to pretend that he was not leaving, because Harry had earned more than pretense, but he was also not going to pretend that leaving was the same as abandoning, because it was not, and the difference was the arrangements he had made which were real. Then he said, "You are not alone in this, Harry." He said it with the specificity of a man who understood exactly what that sentence meant to someone who had been left on a doorstep 11 years ago with a note. There was a distinction between that Dumbledore, the one who had done the calculations of the greatest good, and placed a baby on a cold stone step in November, and walked away, and this one standing in front of him now, saying the thing that was true in the plainest way available. Harry felt the distinction without being able to articulate it. It sat in the same place. Things sat that he hadn't found words for yet. He said, "All right." Dumbledore nodded. He went back to the waiting ministry official. He went through the front doors. Harry stood on the stairs for a moment after, in the specific silence of an absence that was still very recent. Then he heard voices from the direction of the grounds. Hagrid was in the entrance hall by the time Harry reached the bottom of the stairs, or rather, Hagrid was taking up a significant portion of it, which was what Hagrid did in any enclosed space, not aggressively, but simply as a fact of scale. He was carrying his crossbow and his moleskin coat, and he had the expression he wore when he was being cooperative, about something he did not entirely agree with, which was the expression of a man who believed cooperation with authority was right, even when authority was wrong, and who found this belief genuinely difficult to act on, and was acting on it anyway. Behind him was Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, who was wearing a lime-green bowler hat that indicated he considered this a formal occasion, and who had the manner of a man performing something unpleasant that he had convinced himself was necessary. Behind Fudge was Lucius Malfoy, who was not wearing a bowler hat and who had the manner of a man who had arranged for something unpleasant to happen and was present to observe it. Harry watched from the bottom of the stairs. Hagrid was moving toward the door when he passed Harry, and he stopped. He was enormously tall, Hagrid. Harry had to tilt his head back to look at him, and he lowered his great hand carefully and set it briefly on the top of Harry's head. Not a pat, a weight. The weight of a large hand belonging to someone who was not sure when they would do this again and was making it mean something. He said, "You'll be all right." Harry watched him go through the front doors. Fudge followed. Malfoy followed. The doors closed. Harry stood in the entrance hall alone and thought, "I have to be." He went upstairs. Hermione had been petrified on a Thursday afternoon between the library and the hospital wing, and they had found her in the corridor with a mirror in one hand and a page torn from a library book in the other, both held with the rigid insistence of someone who had been mid-thought when the world stopped. Harry and Ron had kept the page. It was a section about basilisks, a page of dense text with an illustration that showed the great serpent in profile, its eye circled, with an annotation in the margin in Hermione's handwriting that said, "Indirect gaze, see also, reflection, water, camera, ghost." Below this, in smaller writing, underlined, pipes, plumbing, location. The mirror made the second point plainly. She had known what she was dealing with. She had been coming to find them when it found her first. What Harry had not known about, until he went back to the dormitory that evening, his chest tight, and his hands doing the particular careful thing hands did when they didn't want to shake, was the note on his bed. It was brief, 2 sides of a small piece of parchment, and it was in Hermione's handwriting, dated 2 days before she was petrified. And it said, "I think I know how the diary got into Ginny's things." She had gone back to the Diagon Alley visit. She had cross-referenced the accounts. Ron's description of the incident at Flourish and Blots, Harry's own description from last August. The way Lucius Malfoy had been present, had made a point of handling Ginny's second-hand books, had made a point of the confrontation that drew all eyes to Arthur and away from his hands. She had found a witness account in a library book about dark artifact trafficking, 6 years old, that described an identical mechanism, the apparently accidental placement of a planted object in a moment of staged distraction. She wrote, "I can't prove it yet, but I think I know who put it there. I think we need to get the diary away from Ginny. I'm going to do more research tonight." She had not come back from the research. Harry had read the note 3 times and put it carefully in the same pocket as Bill's letter and Arthur's letter and the folded one that said, "We miss you here." And then he had gone to find Ron. Ginny was not at breakfast the following morning. Ron noticed it first, had been noticing things about his sister for long enough that her absence from her usual seat registered before he'd consciously processed the scan he'd done of the table. He put his fork down. He said, "She's not here." Harry looked. She wasn't at any of the first-year tables. She wasn't at any table. They checked the dormitory. They checked the common room. Ron checked the girls' corridor with the help of a second year, who confirmed the room was empty and had been empty since the previous evening. Harry went to the library in case, and the library was full of people studying and did not contain Ginny. The castle knew, before any announcement was made, the way castles knew things, the particular silence that moved down a corridor ahead of a piece of news, the quality of people's faces when they'd seen the writing and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Harry and Ron found the corridor on the 2nd floor, at the same time as a small crowd of students who had come from the direction of Charms. The message was on the wall, in the same dark red as the previous 2. Higher this time, as though whoever had written it had not needed to reach hairs. "Skeleton will lie in the chamber forever." Harry read it and thought of Hermione's note. "I think we need to get the diary away from Ginny." He thought of Dumbledore in the entrance hall. "You are not alone in this." He thought of Hagrid's hand on his head. "You'll be all right," he thought. "I have to be." Ron was standing beside him, and his face had done something Harry had not seen it do before. Not fear. Fear was something Ron managed the way most people managed it, messily and visibly, and with continued function. This was not fear. This was something beneath fear, the place you got to when the fear finished its work and left the room. A terrible stillness, the stillness of all the noise in a person stopping at once every part of Ron that was usually Ron, the motion, the noise, the complaint. the laugh going very quiet and very still, and leaving behind something that looked like Ron, but was not currently running. His 11-year-old sister, his family's sister. Harry stood beside him in the corridor with the crowd moving around them and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He put his shoulder against Ron's. Ron did not move. After a while, Ron's hand came up and pressed flat against the wall, not at the writing, below it at the plain stone, the way you put your hand on something solid when you needed something solid. Harry stood there until Ron was ready to move. Then they went to find out what they were going to do. Moaning, Myrtle told them how she died. She told it with the particular relish of someone for whom the telling had become a significant portion of her available activities. The great yellow eyes, she said, enormous, there in the bathroom, between one moment and the next. And then that was all there had been. She described the eyes at length. Harry let her describe them, and thought, I know what those eyes do, and why you didn't die the way the others died, and the answer is that you were already dead. He didn't say this. There was nothing kind about saying it. The sink moved when he spoke to it. Not in English, in the other thing, the thing that lived under English and had always been there, and the pipe responded to it the way water responded to gravity, without argument, because that was simply the direction things went. The tap moved, the basin lowered, the darkness below was absolute, not darkness of the ordinary kind that eyes adjusted to, but a depth of dark that suggested the dark had been down there for a very long time. Ron looked at it, he said, We go together. Harry said, You know the plan. Ron said, he hated the plan. Harry said, he did, too. They went in anyway, dropping into the dark one after the other, the pipe cold and damp under Harry's hands, the slide going far deeper than it had any right to go, until the stone gave way to a tunnel with a low ceiling and a floor that was cold and wet under Harry's palms when he landed. He stood. He pushed his glasses back into place. Ahead of them in the direction of whatever was deeper, there was the faintest greenish light, so faint it barely registered but enough to move by. They moved. The tunnel went in one direction for a long time. Harry counted his steps without meaning to. The ceiling was lower in places, the walls pressing closer, and the floor was covered in something that was probably moss, and probably also other things he did not intend to examine. They did not speak. Ron's presence beside him was the most specific thing in the dark, the sound of his breathing, the familiar weight of someone moving in the same direction. The cave-in came without warning, a sound like everything deciding to be in a different place, stone moving against stone with the grinding certainty of a structure that had been built 1,000 years ago and had been patient about failing. The rubble came down behind him, a cascade of rock and old mortar, and when the sound stopped, the tunnel had ended in a wall of stone where Ron had been. Harry pressed his hands flat against it. The rock was solid, old solid, the kind that did not shift. Ron. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. A pause, a scramble of movement from the other side. Then Ron's voice. I'm here. I'm here. Are you hurt? No, you? No. Another pause. Then, finding the gap, a crack between two pieces of stone where air moved, Harry pressed his fingers through it and felt Ron's hand come up and grip them from the other side. It was brief. The grip was brief, the way things were brief when being brief was more honest than being long. Ron said, go. Harry said, I'll come back. Ron said, I know. A silence. Harry was already turning toward the deeper dark when Ron's voice came again through the rock, less measured, more like Ron. Just so you know, Mum is going to go absolutely mental. Harry stood in the tunnel on the other side of the cave-in, in the dark, with the green light faint ahead of him, and something that was almost a laugh moved through him. He went on. The chamber was enormous. He had not expected enormousness. He had expected enclosed, oppressive, cramped. The logic of hiding something for 1,000 years did not suggest generous proportions. But the chamber was immense. Twin rows of stone columns receding into darkness, each carved with serpents that moved in the uncertain light. A ceiling so high it was invisible above. A long, wet floor that reflected the greenish torches placed at intervals along the walls. At the far end, a stone face that was not a human face, not entirely, with the cold patience of something that had been watching for a very long time. And on the floor, below the face, Ginny. She was on her side, pale, in the way she had been all year, but worse now, the pallor of someone giving up, rather than the pallor of someone merely exhausted, as though the color were retreating from her surface in preparation for something final. She was breathing barely. He ran toward her and stopped. The shade was already forming. It came out of the dark, between the columns, pulling itself together, from nothing into shape, the way shadow coalesced when it wanted to. A boy, 16, tall, with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that were dark. He was handsome in the way that things were handsome when the beauty had been designed for effect rather than grown, every feature precise, constructed, the face of someone who had understood very young that how you looked determined how much you were listened to and had decided to look accordingly. He said his name eventually, in the manner of someone enjoying the telling, told Harry what he'd been doing all year. Ginny's energy, her fear, her trust, turned against her and into fuel. He said, "She has been very useful." He said it with the patient pleasure of a person who had been planning something since long before Harry was born, which was accurate, because Tom Riddle had been planning since long before Harry was born. He said, "You are alone, Potter." He said it with the finality of someone closing an argument. No headmaster, no Hagrid, no adults at all. Just a 12-year-old boy at the bottom of a chamber that had been waiting 500 years to be reopened, with a 1,000-year-old serpent and a shade that was growing more solid by the moment. Harry said, "No, actually, he said it and meant it, not in the tactical sense." He was not deluded about the tactical sense, was not performing confidence he didn't have. He meant it in the sense that was true under every other sense, the sense of a boy who knew which stair creaked, who had 3 letters in the pocket over his heart, who had sat at a kitchen table at 5 in the morning and been told that not knowing what you want is also a kind of answer. The sense of someone who had something to go back to in the chamber. That sense was not comfort. It was weight, ballast, the thing that made the floor solid. Riddle smiled. He raised the wand, Harry's wand, borrowed through the diary's workings, conjured from the chamber's dark, and from somewhere deep in the stone, something began to move. The sound of it was enormous. The floor shook with it, with the weight of something very old and very large. And Harry closed his eyes and kept them closed. He heard Fawkes before he saw the light. A sound of wings. Enormous wings, the kind that belonged to something that had been flying much longer than 12-year-old boys had been alive. And then warmth, a gold warmth, in a place that had been cold for 1,000 years. He opened his eyes for a fraction of a second and saw a flash of crimson and gold, Fawkes banking in the dark, above the basilisk's head, and then the sound the basilisk made, and then Fawkes's cry piercing. And then Harry opened his eyes fully because the basilisk's eyes were gone. The sorting hat hit the chamber floor near his feet. He did not think about whether it would work. He reached in. The sword came out cold and heavy, and exactly the right weight, a silver blade with rubies in the hilt that threw back the chamber's green light in a way that made the light look like something worth having. He held it, and the grip was solid, and his hands did not shake. He did not have time to think about whether his hands were going to shake. The basilisk was blind and moving by sound, and the sound it was following was him. He fought the way the tunnel had made him fight. By instinct, by the displacement of air, and the vibration in the stone floor, and the direction sound came from. The basilisk's head struck twice and missed twice, the columns exploding where it hit. Harry moved and moved and moved, always moving the sword up. He found the moment, the angle, the opening, and drove the sword into the roof of its mouth. The basilisk's death was slow, the way the deaths of very old things were slow. A withdrawal of something enormous from a very large body. Harry pulled the sword back and stepped back, and the floor shook, and then it was still. He turned toward Riddle's shade, which was fading, growing less solid as the basilisk died. And Riddle's face was doing something it hadn't done before, something that was not for once controlled. Harry looked for the diary, found it, near Ginny's hand, dark leather, unopened, but the thing inside it, still audible if you listened, still present. He picked up a basilisk fang from the chamber floor. The scream was not from anyone's throat. It was a sound that came from everywhere the diary was, and then it was done. Ginny gasped. Her color came back in a rush. Not gradually, but all at once, the way water filled a vessel, her hands moving and her eyes opening, and the particular quality of someone being Ginny again, rather than the thing that had been wearing Ginny present in every part of her face. She looked at the diary on the floor. She looked at the basilisk. She looked at Harry. She said, "Harry?" He said, "Yeah." The fang had gone into his arm somewhere during the fight. He was aware of this with a specificity that was separate from the rest of the situation. A clean, cold sensation moving upward from the puncture, with the patient certainty of something that intended to reach his heart. He sat down on the chamber floor because his legs had decided this was appropriate. The ceiling above him was carved with Slytherin's face, cold and high and patient, and Harry looked at it and thought, "I have to get Ginny out." Fawkes landed on his arm. The tears came before Harry had thought about asking for them. Golden warm, falling on the puncture wound, with the quality of something that had been healing things for much longer than 1,000 years, and knew exactly how. The cold retreated. The moving sensation retreated. Harry sat on the chamber floor and felt the venom leave him, and it felt like a door opening, like a window, like the particular sensation of arriving somewhere you had been trying to reach. He got up. He got Ginny up. She was unsteady on her feet, and he put her arm over his shoulder, and they moved back through the chamber, past the dead basilisk, past the columns, toward the tunnel. Fawkes flew ahead, a gold light in the dark, unhurried, exactly as fast as they needed. The cave-in was a wall of rubble, and behind it was silence that had a person in it. "Ron," Harry said, a sound of movement, immediate. Then Ron's voice, very close to the stone, and the quality of it was the quality of someone who had been sitting in the dark for an indeterminate amount of time not knowing, which was a quality Harry recognized from having produced it in other people without meaning to, and which he resolved, in that moment. "Ginny's here," Harry said. "She's all right." A longer silence. The kind that did something to itself, internally. Harry and Fawkes moved the rubble. Fawkes carrying stones in his talons, with the calm of an animal that had been doing extraordinary things, long enough that extraordinary was simply the appropriate effort for the occasion. The gap widened. Ginny moved through it first, and Ron was on the other side with his hands braced against the stone and his face doing something Harry did not have adequate vocabulary for the specific expression of someone who had held a very large amount of something very carefully in a very dark place. Ginny looked at him. She said, very small, his name. Ron. Ron said, "It's all right." He was looking at Harry when he said it. Harry came through the gap. He stood in the tunnel on Ron's side. He was covered in a considerable amount of things he was going to need to think about later. His arm had stopped hurting, which was Fawkes' doing, but the place where the fang had been was tender in the specific way of something that had recently been serious. He stood in the tunnel and looked at Ron's face, which was no longer doing the thing it had been doing, and was now doing the thing it did when Ron was managing something from the inside out. Ron said, "Mum really is going to go mental," Harry said. "I know," Ron said. "Good, come on." They went back through the tunnel, the three of them, with Fawkes flying ahead and the darkness retreating before them, as though it had somewhere else to be. The hospital wing smelled of dittany and something clean and faintly herbal, and outside the window the Scottish hills were doing the particular thing they did in late spring. Harry was in the bed nearest the window, which was where Madame Pomfrey put people who were going to be fine but needed supervising anyway, and in the bed beside him Ginny was asleep with her colour fully returned. Her hair spread across the pillow in a way that made her look like the person she actually was, rather than the person the diary had been making her into for 9 months. Harry watched her for a while. The watching was the thing he could do, so he did it. McGonagall was in the chair at the foot of his bed. He had not noticed her arrive, which suggested she had been there for some time, before he was fully awake. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her composure intact, and she was looking at the window, not at him, the deliberate tact of someone who had a thing to say and was choosing the angle of it carefully. She was wearing her tartan robes, and her square glasses had caught the morning light and turned it into 2 rectangles of gold. She said, still looking at the window, she was very glad he was alive. Harry said, "Me too, Professor." She made a sound. It was brief and mostly controlled, but in a different register, in the register of something permitted rather than managed. It would have been a laugh. They sat with that for a while, both of them looking at the window, and neither of them feeling the need to make it larger than it was. Dumbledore arrived the following morning. He came to the hospital wing before he did anything else, before the governors, before the paperwork, before whatever administrative machinery the school required, to acknowledge that its headmaster was no longer suspended and could be addressed by that title again. He came to the hospital wing, which told Harry something. He came in with his travelling cloak still on, and his half-moon spectacles slightly misted from the outside air, and he stood at the foot of Harry's bed and looked at him with those very attentive blue eyes, and said very little. He said the governors had rescinded the suspension. He said this in the manner of a man reporting a fact that had never been in serious doubt, though the path to it had been somewhat complicated. He said Harry had done a remarkable thing again, and the school owed him something it would not easily be able to name or repay. He said the diary had been destroyed. Lucius Malfoy's role in placing it among Ginny Weasley's school things was now documented, attested, and a matter of wizarding record. He said this last sentence in the particular voice he used for things that were true and that he was going to make sure stayed true, and then he did not say what he expected to happen to Lucius Malfoy. His expression said it would be complicated and drawn out, and would involve the kind of institutional reluctance that money and family connections reliably produced in bureaucratic proceedings, and would ultimately arrive at something that did not feel, to anyone directly harmed, like sufficient justice. His expression said he knew this, and he had known it before it happened, and he was going to pursue it anyway. Harry nodded. He understood the expression. Lucius Malfoy came to the school the following day. He came nominally to rescind the suspension in person, and thus perform the particular social fiction of a man acting in good faith. And he came with his silver walking stick and his platinum hair and the cold precision of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly what he was permitted to say. He had Dobby with him, the house elf moving at his heel with the low, careful attention of a creature that had learned to make itself as small as possible in the presence of its master, and had been practicing this for a very long time. Dumbledore met him in the entrance hall and spoke to him quietly and clearly, with specifics, in the manner of a man who had gathered every available fact and arranged them in the order that would be most difficult to misinterpret. Lucius said things that were deniable. Dumbledore said things that were true. The conversation concluded. Harry had been standing in the corridor that led off the entrance hall, and he had the ruined diary in his hands. He pulled off his own sock. He wrapped the sock around the diary's blackened cover and crossed to where Lucius was turning to leave, and he held the bundle out. "Your diary, I think," he said. "Sir." Lucius took it with the expression of someone touching something unpleasant, purely for the maintenance of appearances. He peeled back the cover. The sock fell out. Lucius looked at it with pale, cold eyes, and then threw it aside, the reflex of a man who did not touch other people's clothing. And Dobby was already moving, already reaching, the sock landing in the house elf's hands, like a thing that had always been going there. Dobby looked at the sock. The sound he made was small and bewildered, and then very large and not bewildered at all. He looked at Harry with green eyes that were doing several things at once, and none of them were the careful smallness he had worn all year as a creature navigating the proximity of his master without incident. He said, "Harry Potter has given Dobby a sock." He said it the way you said things that you had not been sure were real and were now required to process as real. Harry thought of every time Dobby had tried to help him this year, every catastrophic, misguided attempt to protect him, the barrier sealed, the bludger tampered with, the whole increasingly desperate series of interventions from a creature who had looked at Harry's life. He thought you were trying. You were always trying. He didn't say it. There was nothing wrong with simply letting Dobby be free. Lucius left. He did not do so gracefully, but he did so. The Wizengamot's letter arrived at the Burrow on a Tuesday in May. Arthur was at the kitchen table with his morning tea when the owl arrived, and he recognized the green wax seal before he'd unfolded the parchment, because he had been checking the post with a particular quality of attention every Tuesday for 6 months. He read it in the way he read ministry documents, carefully, from the beginning, without skipping to the outcome, because the words before the outcome were the words that would matter if the outcome was ever questioned. It was formal and dense in the way of Wizengamot documents, which were written to be unambiguous rather than to be read comfortably. And the relevant part was in the second paragraph. The 6-month provisional period having been completed without incident, the minor in question having expressed continued preference for the current arrangement, clearly and voluntarily, before a qualified official. The Ministry of Magic having received no formal objection of record from any party withstanding to file one. Full permanent guardianship is hereby granted to Arthur Septimus Weasley and Molly Weasley née Pruitt, effective upon the date of this letter's receipt. Arthur read it a second time. Molly appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at his face, which told her what she needed to know. She crossed to the table and read it over his shoulder, once, which was all it took, and then she went to the stove and put the kettle on. The kettle was the loudest thing in the house for a while after that. The Hogwarts Express left Hogsmeade at 11 o'clock, and Harry spent most of the journey back in the compartment with Ron and Ginny and Hermione, who had been released from the hospital wing with the full reinstated use of all her faculties and a considerable backlog of opinions. By the time they pulled into King's Cross, she had covered most of the major points and showed no sign of running out. Ron had fallen asleep twice. Ginny, beside Harry, was looking out the window with the particular expression of someone who had come back from somewhere far away and was still occasionally surprised to find themselves back. Harry watched London arrive outside the windows. The city looked like itself. He came through the barrier on the London side of the station with his trunk on the trolley and Hedwig in her cage, balanced on top, and the school year in his chest with all the weight of everything it had been, 9 months. He had not known, 9 months ago, that 9 months could be the kind of measurement that applied to more than gestation. It applied, apparently, to the amount of time it took to learn which stair creaked in a house in Devon and to stop checking each morning when you would have to leave. He looked up. Arthur was in the muggle suit with the tie slightly off-center, the way the tie was always slightly off-center, waving before Harry had fully cleared the crowd, waving with the arm of a man who had spotted what he was looking for and saw no reason to be subtle about the fact. Beside him, Molly was in her traveling cloak, and she saw Harry at the same moment Arthur saw him, and her face did the thing. It did the thing he had learned to read and had not stopped being surprised by. The uncomplicated gladness of someone for whom his presence in a room was simply good news. Harry stopped. He had spent 12 years training himself out of wanting things, because wanting had a cost, and he had known, with the precision of someone who had learned it very young, that the cost was always his. He had spent 9 months learning, in the patient, incremental way, that knowledge arrived when it was allowed to, that the training had been wrong, that it had been a response to the specific circumstance of the Dursleys and not a general law of the universe, and that the specific circumstance of the Dursleys was not the world. He walked toward them. Molly hugged him first. She always did, and it still surprised him every time. Not the hug itself, not anymore, but the fact of still being surprised by it, the way the warmth hadn't become ordinary. He thought it might not become ordinary for a while yet, and he was, he found, comfortable with that. Arthur clapped him on the shoulder, once solid, and picked up the far end of the trunk with the air of someone who had decided this was simply a thing he was going to do. Behind them, Ron was already in an argument with Fred about something that had apparently begun on the train and showed no signs of resolution, and George was cheerfully facilitating it from the side. Ginny caught Harry's eye across the small chaos of it and smiled, the particular smile of someone who had come very close to something dark and had come back from it, and knew that both things were true, and was glad to be on this side of that knowledge. Harry put his trunk in the boot of the Ford Anglia. The car was the same car it had always been, slightly temperamental, reliably sufficient, smelling faintly of countryside. He took the window seat because it was available, and because he had learned to take things when they were available, rather than waiting to see if they would be taken from him. The car filled up around him in the familiar, specific way of a family occupying a space. Argument and elbow and the sound of someone rummaging in the wrong bag, and Molly's voice from the front asking if everyone was there. Everyone was there. He knew the prophecy was still out there somewhere, or not the prophecy specifically, but what it described. Voldemort, diminished and patient, not finished. The blood ward was gone and he was not invulnerable, and the chamber had not been the last thing that would need facing. He knew this. It sat in the back of his chest, the way true things sat when you had decided to live with them rather than around them, present, weighty, not something to be surprised by. Next year, and the year after, and the year after that, there would be more. He had always known this in some form. He would keep knowing it. What was different, what 9 months had built in the place where the knowing lived, was the other thing, that he would not face it from the position he had started the year in. The position of someone who had nobody, who had nothing to lose, who fought because there was nothing waiting for him afterward. And so fighting was simply what you did when fighting was what was needed. He would face what came from the position of someone who had a house in Devon and a creaking third step and a clock in a kitchen with his name on one of the hands, and a family who missed him when he was gone and said so in letters. Whether that was enough, he couldn't say. He was 12 years old. The arithmetic of enough was not something he could do yet, but it was more than he had had before. He was quite sure of that. The Ford Anglia pulled away from the curb. Arthur navigated the London traffic with the serene attention of a man who had driven this road before and was glad to be driving it again. The city moved past the windows and then gave way to the motorway, and then to roads that narrowed and curved and began to look like countryside. And Harry leaned his head against the glass and watched England arrive, Devon-shaped